Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Flourish FM. In this episode, we speak to Susan Kaiser Greenland. Susan is a mindfulness educator and best-selling author who teaches mindfulness to children, teens, parents, and educators for everyday practices. She's a former corporate attorney, but transformed her career after discovering meditation, founding Inner Kids to teach secular mindfulness in schools and community programs. She's been studying Buddhism for over 30 years. She's authored several widely translated books, including her latest release, which came out this month, July 2024, Real World Enlightenment, Discovering Ordinary Magic in Everyday Life. The book offers 50 powerful tools for modern seekers, providing practical strategies to foster meaningful connections and alleviate the pressures of modern life. And it's our focus in today's conversation. Nick, what did you most enjoy about our conversation with Susan?
Yeah, I don't want to oversimplify it because she adds a lot of, I think, thoughtful complexity to, some of these concepts and ideas. But what I really took away from it is I think she's trying to help concretize how to take on, let's say, mindfulness or meditation practices or ways of being and behaving that lead to more moments of meaning. Mm-hmm. Right. And that might be unpleasant. That might be pleasant. A lot of times it's pleasant. Right. But ultimately it's moments of meaning and connection and transcendence and things that are, regardless of they're pleasant or unpleasant, they're very forming. Right. And often very nourishing. Mm-hmm. And so like we've talked sort of abstractly about concepts like meaning before and sometimes concretely, and we've gotten into mindfulness and meditation, but I think Susan just does a really nice job of bridging the two together in very tangible and consumable ways. So yeah, I enjoyed the conversation.
Absolutely. Me too. It's a great conversation. We really hope you all enjoy it. This is Strategies for Real World Enlightenment with our guest, Susan Kaiser Greenland. Susan, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
Very well. Thank you very much. So we've loved reading your latest book published just this month. Thank you so much for sending us copies. Real World Enlightenment, Discovering the Ordinary Magic in Everyday Life. So let's kick off by figuring out what exactly real world enlightenment is. What is it? And how does it differ from enlightenment more broadly, historically?
Real world enlightenment is something I would bet you and all of your listeners have experienced. It's that moment when your shoulders drop and you connect with something that is far greater than yourself. So your ego just drops out for a moment and you feel like you're part of something vast. It's a non-conceptual experience, hard to put words to it. It's a little bit ineffable, but it's the type of thing that we experience every now and again at, really extreme moments of joy, extreme moments of peace, and sometimes extreme moments of sadness. So it's that moment when just the ego drops away and it's a non-conceptual feeling of being connected to something far, far greater than yourself.
What's so funny, Susan, is you say, as you were writing or saying non-conceptual, I was trying to write concepts that I resonated with. So will you explain more what you mean by non-conceptual and maybe tell me what I did wrong there and trying to understand it?
No. You didn't do anything wrong. In fact, you did something very right because it's all about awareness, right? So you were aware of the concepts, right? We can't stop concepts from bubbling up in our minds. So you did something very, very right when it comes to awareness. What I mean by non-conceptual is it's those moments that are difficult to describe. There's a word for it. It's called ineffable. Like joy is ineffable. Like when you get completely absorbed in music, that's ineffable. It's hard to describe. When you're there with your child, when they're first born and your jaw drops, it's like, it's these moments you're not really thinking but yet you're having an experience. And that is the non-conceptual aspect of this. And non-conceptual experiences are also a big part of formal meditation practice. So what can happen as we get more comfortable in formal meditation practice, we can bring that formal practice out into the world and actually experience these kind of ineffable moments and maybe even extend them a little bit longer or make the circumstances more ripe for them to emerge.
Can they be bad experiences as well as good experiences?
Yeah.
So
people have them.
What
right?
do we
So
mean by bad and good, John? You mean like pleasant and unpleasant?
Yeah. So, I mean, it could be the birth of your first child. It could be seeing the Northern Lights, but could it also be receiving some devastating news, enduring heartbreak, bereavement, and so on?
It can. And I've had experiences during heartbreak and bereavement that I would call these experiences of real world enlightenment. I especially remember, when my parents passed and that sort of thing. But there is this non-conceptual quality, means that there's not really a watcher there. You're not really watching it. You're just experiencing it. And they last usually just a second.
Yeah. So when someone says in these kind of experiences that they're lost for words, in experience that brings about positive emotions or one of negative emotions, there's a literal truth in that, right? A reason why someone might be lost for words is because the experience can't be captured in words, because it's something beyond ordinary experiences.
The classical or the traditional descriptions, or it's like a ring of smoke, or it's like a bubble. You try to catch it and it pops. Usually in these instances, if you try to grab onto it, it dissipates. But when you're talking about the positive or the negative emotion piece of it, remember, it's an experience. It's just it's more of a sensation. It's something that you feel. It's not such, and then later you think about it, but while it's actually happening, it's more of a felt sense. Does any of this relate to you guys? Have you guys either had one of these experiences?
Yeah. Well, I think certainly, yes. I think what I'm doing of course, my tendency, just kind of being nerdy and scientific, is to keep like thinking concepts. And I know we're going to get to this eventually, so I don't mean to jump the gun, but it just sounds like what we would describe as meaning, right? There's elements of transcendence, self-transcendence, right? Connection that might be spiritual. Like there could be a lot of different sources of it, but if I'm getting on the right track and understanding it there, then I would certainly say yes. And it would absolutely vibe, I think, with the point John raised about those meaningful experiences, or maybe you'd call them real world sort of enlightened experiences, are not affectively exclusively positive or negative, right? No. Pleasant or unpleasant. They cover the spectrum.
They cover the spectrum. And I would suggest that, I'm not a scientist, and I'm guessing you guys are. I would suggest that they may even be sometimes something a little different, something that doesn't fit within one of those positive or negative boxes.
You have an example? What do you think? Like, what are you thinking of?
Well, other words that might help describe it would be wonder, a feeling of wonder, or a feeling of awe, that sort of thing. So when I have those feelings, it really is, it has a different quality to it than something that is absolutely positive or absolutely negative. It's just the edges are more frayed in a very positive way. I'm not trying to be airy-fairy here. These are experiences that everyone that I have met and talked to over the course of my life, people have had experiences that kind of fall somewhere within this realm. Oneness is another word that has been used. The mystics use the word oneness. That sense of being connected.
Yeah, and that's where I was going with meaning too. But it's interesting you brought up wonder and awe. We had a conversation with Monica Parker months ago. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Monica's work or book, but those are the words we talked about a lot. And I think we were along a similar thread of like potentially really meaningful experiences, but maybe affectively ambiguous a little bit, right? Or a little harder to kind of, like you said, wrap your hands around and describe the quality of.
Yeah, or harder to just categorize. The idea, and nobody has asked me these questions before, so I'm really appreciating them. And I've been talking to lots and lots of podcasters and radio shows, so thank you for this. So this is the first time I've said this out loud, and I haven't written it yet, or probably won't. But there is this frayed edges to the quality of it. as far as not being positive and not being negative. It's just what happens with the meditation experience is that things just stop being so tight. Things stop being so solid. It all starts to loosen up a little bit. So that's the idea that I'm trying to get across as far as not being actually in one category or the other. It's more fluid and changing and made up of many, many different parts and pieces that are interdependent and constantly in flux.
Blended, less siloed.
Okay, so just lay it out so far. This is pretty complicated and important that we clarify this before we go on. So it's a feeling of oneness, a connection with something beyond our worldly experience and maybe worldly existence, which it's impossible perhaps to put into words, or at least extremely difficult, certainly not expressed in literal words. Maybe you have to use metaphors or analogies to try and express it. It's very difficult to conceptualize it, perhaps even impossible to precisely conceptualize it. It can be triggered by pleasant or unpleasant experiences, typically very deeply pleasant, deeply unpleasant experiences, things that really strike us. They're not kind of your everyday experiences, but more rare experiences like, well, maybe not actually. If a sunset could bring it about, could a sunset bring about this kind of experience?
Yeah, a sunset on its own can be it. There's often a surprise element to these things, as far as it kind of catches you by surprise.
Okay. And
as far as I think you said something about otherworldly, that doesn't resonate with me as much as a sense of being connected to something far vaster than something that perhaps our human mind can even really get.
Okay. And so, and let's get some examples on the table to make it clearer. So that connection could be a connection with another person, a connection with a belief in God or a God or something metaphysical. Could be a strong feeling of love for a person or for the world. Or a feeling of kind of safeness, perhaps, in the world, a feeling of gratitude for your life. But these kind of things that are quite deep emotional experiences that go beyond you and magnify to another person or other people or the world, or maybe just your life or existence in general.
And they often last an instant.
Oh, okay. They're short experiences then.
They tend to be very short. It's like a glimpse of something.
So, okay. So that gets back to part of the root of the start of the question. How does it differ from enlightenment more broadly and historically? So please clarify if I've misunderstood what enlightenment kind of means for example, in Buddhism. But I've often thought of enlightenment as kind of a way of being that a person reaches. They become enlightened, like the Buddha became enlightened, right? But if the Buddha became enlightened, surely that wasn't momentary, right? That was a state of mind, a way of being that he reached that maybe lasted the rest of his life. And is that not something also people are searching for?
Certainly. There are people searching for it. There are people who spend a whole lifetime searching for it and working toward it and seeing, I hate to use the word progress in this context because it's not a linear thing. It's, again, all of this is much more web-like. It kind of, it's not so direct. But what I was hoping to do with this book was to demystify that idea of enlightenment a bit and demystify the idea of this unattainability of this particular state, unless if you're willing to go sit on a mountaintop for the rest of your life and dedicate yourself to this, which there are people who do, and I have great respect for. So that's why the name Real World Enlightenment is more, this is something that is within all of our grasps that we can actually catch a taste of. And if you've tasted it, then even if the taste, I remember having these moments like when I was a child. I remember being on long drives in the back seat of a car, my parents' car, and just having these moments where the sound around me had a different quality. And they were like, they would, leave very quickly. But those kind of different sensory experiences that actually made me feel more connected, more integrated, and qualitatively different than the work-a-day, one step in front of another life. Those are the experiences that once you have a taste of, I think that's what a lot of seekers are seeking, is more of that. And so my hope was to demystify the idea of enlightenment and give people the hope or the possibility that there are qualities like love and compassion and kindness and joy and balance and playfulness that we can drop into and connect with any time of any day. And that will open things up for us a little bit.
Okay. So a difference then between this and, if you like, old school enlightenment, traditional enlightenment, is that this is typically a momentary, short experience.
A difference in this is that the ones that people feel, that everyday people will tell you that they felt, once you kind of describe, if you ever had that moment of awe or of wonder or connectedness or oneness, those moments are very common. Many, many people have had those moments. And so once you've tasted that moment, you have the sense, the experience that this is a potential that could be extended. This is something that could happen more often. And that kind of hope, that kind of experience that leads to a sense that there are different ways of life than the usual kind of humdrum or workaday life, that is very powerful to people. So that's really what I'm talking about. It's a little, listen, I have studied Buddhism for a long time in a very classical sense. Little provocative, the title I chose. I recognize that. But I really wanted to kind of demystify this idea of enlightenment and make it feel more available to people like me.
So for what it's worth, you kind of asked earlier if it resonated, but not knowing a ton about my background in the last couple of years, John knows this here, Susan, but I mentioned earlier, my wife and I are pretty nomadic these days. And for the last really almost 3 years, we've designed that nomadic life around visits to American national parks, right? And turn it into a lot of hiking.
Yeah.
So that went from sort of haphazardly deciding to visit one, which was Zion in southwestern Utah, to pretty quick addiction to, hey, I want to see all these things, because that sense of awe and kind of weird transcendence. And I'm laughing a little bit because I was just recently on a family vacation in a really beautiful area of Michigan, Mackinac Island. And we're looking over where two of the Great Lakes, John, meet. Right. And you can just see water, fresh water, basically as far as you can look. And it's really beautiful. And a lot of the families talking about how could you imagine a more beautiful place? And, I didn't say it, but in my head, I'm just thinking, yes, every national park with mountains. It gives a feeling that is hard to describe, right? But you are exactly right. As soon as I tasted it, I thought, oh, we can replicate the hell out of that. Right. And so I started chasing. I wrote the word down you just used, seeking. But I also want to ask about that, because earlier I thought I heard, and maybe I misunderstood it, that maybe the tendency to try to grasp for these things causes them to actually slip through our fingers. And so I'm curious about the tension between seeking and allowing, I guess, to happen more organically.
Well, we have something else in common besides Michigan, that my husband and I are big national park fans too, and we travel all
Makes
around.
sense.
And so there's the mountains, and there's also the desert spaciousness.
Yes.
That sense of, just the vastness of the sky and the space around you. And that sets the table for this kind of an experience. But I think, again, we can parse it up a little bit. When we try to grasp at it, when we're having it, what we're doing then is we're going from a non-conceptual experience into a conceptual one. We're trying to grasp it. That's when it slips through your hands. But I think the world is full of seekers. I think people are seeking something like this along the way. And I think that doesn't mean it slips through your fingers. That's just a way of seeking it. And the idea, at least in classical Buddhism and in other traditions as well, is that what we're seeking is really with us all along. So what we're seeking is a connection to these human qualities like love, compassion, wisdom, awareness, that sort of thing. And that's with us all along. It's just we get in our own way. And that's why we have a hard time connecting with it. So that's why these more extreme experiences, these aha moments, these light bulb moments, these non-conceptual experiences, once we tasted them, then it's easier to think, if I want to see if I can have more of that, I want more of that, then how do I get out of my own way so that I can tap into those kind of experiences?
Well, some of it's just about spotlighting what is already there
And
in some way, shape, or form. Yeah, connecting to it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Love this.
So the distinction, I think, between seeking, right, and then when you're in it, trying to grab onto it makes good sense to me, right? So you might take actions that increase the probability that that experience might take place, but then
That's
we're
right.
kind of saying just stay open to it and not too rigid and just let it be what it's going to be. If you even recognize you're in it, because it's so short-lived, right? So that makes good sense. And at the same time, I want to ask a follow-up. I don't know if you're familiar with Rick Hansen at all, or like some, right. Okay. So in Hardwiring for Happiness, and we had Rick on for a couple episodes recently, and Hardwiring for Happiness, he writes about what he calls a HEAL method. Are you familiar with this at all?
I know Rick, but I don't remember that piece of the book. Yeah.
So basically, he's making the argument that HEAL, have, enrich, amplify, and link, is a mindful way to sort of download or install some of those moments that we want to spotlight that are more positive or nourishing or whatever it might be. And I'm just wondering how that idea does or does not vibe with you, given some of the, it sounds like, constraints you've seen around these real world enlightenment experiences.
Well, I'm a huge fan of Rick's, and we've known each other for a long time. I wasn't familiar with HEAL, but it makes a lot of sense to me. Again, what happens in this world of people working and experiencing and exploring this inner type of experience is often people come to it from a therapeutic standpoint, or and other people come to it from a meditation standpoint. So in the meditation standpoint, we would not do any of that on the cushion. In the meditation standpoint, on the cushion, by simply allowing what comes up to come up, allowing it to come, go, fade away, developing skills so that when that stuff, we start grabbing onto it, we can then ground ourselves and then open back up again. Just that process in and of itself, without our doing anything to it, actually starts to work its magic. Then off the cushion, obviously, at least in my belief system, in my experience system, and in the way my teachers teach, to sit on the cushion as long as I've sat on the cushion is to be able to take it out into the world. So taking it out into the world, what you would do is you would kind of take out the experiences you've had, and then you latch on to something like what Rick is talking about, which is a very specific way to try to make sense of it, to try to make sense of that experience. So that's how I would link the two. And I think that 1-2 punch, one, allowing yourself to have the experience without judging it, without expecting something, without having an expectation or an attachment to what's going to happen because you had that experience. That allows something very different happen to your system and your mind and your perspective than what happens when you're in the workaday world. I was a lawyer before I started working with kids, in the workaday world where, you're very linear oriented and very result oriented. I mean, one of the great reliefs of the practice of meditation is not just becoming very comfortable with the limitations of human perception, so comfortable with not knowing, but also really developing a comfort level with focusing on the goodness of what you're doing and letting go of the result. And in order to focus on the goodness of what you're doing and let go of the result, you really have to be comfortable with this idea that our all too human perspective, no matter how hard we try, is limited. So to expect us to be able to figure out the result is expect ourselves to be able to figure out the result can be counterproductive. We can aim toward a result, but there's only so much we can do.
It's such an interesting sort of like kind of paradox, kind of tension, right? We see this a lot in like the performance world as well. Like focus on process is actually more likely to lead to good outcomes, but it's kind of counterintuitive and not easy to do, right?
Yeah, it takes practice.
Yeah.
It takes practice and it takes positive experiences. Again, it goes to when you do it and you have a sense of kind of relief over it, a sense of, oh wow, this is a spaciousness around this process. You're doing something as hard as you can and trying to get it right, but you're letting go of outcome. And you feel the kind of spaciousness and the freedom in that. Once you've tasted that, then that helps you to go back and do it again and again and again. And it's that process of going back over and over again that we start to internalize some of this stuff.
Hi, friends. Nick here with just a brief interlude to share with you an update on one of our newest partnerships with the Anti-Fragile Academy. Throughout John and I's conversations with many, if not most, of our guests, one thing has been made really clear. In order for people to flourish, thrive, experience the good life, they need to develop the capacity to not only navigate and endure, but ideally grow from the bad, grow from unpleasant experiences. That's why we're thrilled to be partnering with our newest sponsor, the Anti-Fragile Academy, an organization that I co-founded with Dr. Adam Wright, Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals. At the Anti-Fragile Academy, we work with adolescent athletes, executives, and educators to help them understand some of the science, not just of optimal performance, but of well-being and anti-fragility. The ability not only to endure and bounce back from unpleasantness, but to actually come back stronger, to grow from it. Between Adam and I, we've worked with Fortune 100 companies, Inc. 300 executives, Division I programs, and elite professional athletes and Olympians from all over the world. To find out more about how you can leverage anti-fragility training, check out our website at theantifragileacademy.com.
I want to draw attention to a beautiful quote early in your book. You write that real world enlightenment taps into an enduring, reliable sense of love, connection, and well-being that's within us, regardless of our circumstances. And that when we tap into this sense, our connection with the love and well-being inside us grows stronger. Now, given all these examples of where we can find real-world enlightenment in pleasurable and unpleasurable experiences, how do we know when we've experienced it? What kind of indications can we look for if it, especially since it's ineffable, it's almost impossible, perhaps impossible to really fully express in a concept. So how can we say, I had a real experience of real world enlightenment that day, that night, and so on?
I think you basically have a sense that something has shifted. You get a sense of a shift, and that shift might have just been for an instant, but you get a sense of, oh, wow, something has just shifted from kind of the general perspective or mindset that I have. And that's it. And maybe you don't call it anything, or maybe it doesn't really land with you the first time, but you do sense a shift.
Okay. Let's go a bit further on that. What kind of shift do we think? A shift in the way you think about some area of life or about yourself? Maybe quite a paradigm shift, for example, or a fundamental shift, a reframing, let's say, of the way you see some challenge you're facing or a path ahead of you. Could it be quite a subtle shift?
These moments are not, some of the moments I imagine people have can change their lives, but the moments I'm talking to are just shifts where you kind of have a gap. Mm-hmm. There's basically a gap between conceptual thought and experience. It's that simple. And it doesn't need to go more than that. That's plenty. That's plenty. So when you experience the gap, meditators talk about the gap all the time. You experience when the thoughts drop away and for a moment you're in a non-conceptual space. When you're out walking around and you experience this gap, that is the moment of, that's the shift. That's where you recognize oh, that's just a little bit different. What it means, whether it will mean anything to you, whether it's something that you want to pursue or learn more about, that's really an individual thing.
Right. So let's now bring this more directly in connection with meditation then, because mindfulness practices and meditation in particular are growing in popularity year on year, partly because research is growing on the substantial benefits there for our well-being, for our mental and also our physical health, and popularization of them, and the more kind of ready availableness, as it were, of things like meditation retreats and so on. So that connects with kind of connecting your book with the time which we're living. So do you think real world enlightenment is particularly important in the time which we're living today? If so, why?
Oh, yeah. Well, real world enlightenment is the title of this book. What we're talking about so far in this podcast is a very specific experience of openness and a non-conceptual experience. But the type of way of being in the world that you were talking about, which comes from classical enlightenment, and there is a real world way of being in the world that is aligned with these concepts. That type of being in the world is one where we become more comfortable with uncertainty, where we become less reactive, where we are able to kind of be a little bit more light around things, take ourselves a little bit less seriously, those types of things. And honestly, one of the reasons I wrote this book I didn't write this book to zone in on what this one non-conceptual experience was of real world enlightenment, although that is how I started the book. I wrote the book to highlight universal themes that cut across wisdom traditions that lead to a wiser and compassionate, more way of being in the world. And that, I think, could never be more important than now, because right now we're in a pretty polarized place. So this idea of developing the capacity to be less reactive, and I think you asked earlier, how do you know when this is working or something like it? The people that I have seen, my clients, from children to adults to colleagues to friends to family members, you see this work, this inner work they're doing, working when you start to see them become a little bit less reactive, a little bit more open-minded, a little bit more open-hearted. And with that comes this, which I already said once, a comfort level with not having all the answers. So you ask why this matters now? Right now, we live in a polarized world where people are awful darn sure of themselves and absolutely sure that they know the answer, right or wrong, this or that. This leads to a more expansive way of looking at what's happening and seeing that it's not as solid as it may seem. Starting with your thoughts and emotions.
So in terms of the kind of the pressing real world challenges that real world enlightenment might address, one is polarization in all senses, not just say political polarization, but polarization between various groups of people, individuals and so on. And is that largely because what real world enlightenment cultivates, it brings about is this gap between action and the conceptual kind of framing of some experience?
Yeah, but I think it'd be helpful to back up a little bit. I mean, the promise of meditation and the promise of this type of work really starts with awareness, right? So we just start with awareness. It isn't so grand. It isn't so big. Once we're aware of something, all of a sudden there's going to be a shift. If you look at systems theory, one little tiny change in a system, the whole system changes. Once we become aware of a tendency of mind or heart or habit, all of a sudden things start to shift. And again, I've talked a lot about things go from looking like this to seeming be a little bit loose, more made up of many parts and pieces that are interdependent and constantly changing. So it starts with awareness. And from that, we can take it, the individual can take it wherever they want to go. The hope is to reframe it all towards love, kindness, and connection. That's the hope. We bring awareness. We need focus, right? We need focus. We need attention in order to actually use any of our life skills, whether it's reframing, caring, connecting. We need the capacity to self-regulate. that requires attention. So really, it all starts with awareness. I feel like I didn't answer your question, though.
No, you did. And I was just trying to get to precisely why real world enlightenment could reduce such dramatic polarization we see in the world today, and the kind of real world problems this could really address, and how that connects with what you mentioned about this gap we have between an experience and taking an action in relation to that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps greater awareness, tell me if I'm wrong, creates, well, you mentioned self-regulation. Emotional self-regulation is one of the skills that is involved in building greater self-awareness, such that we're not so reactive,
Mm-hmm.
that we do stop to pause and stop to think and build awareness of more things that are relevant to some consideration we're making, that might help prevent such significant polarization by people understanding one another better, developing greater compassion for each other, love for one another, and so on.
It's a sequential process. I mean, maybe in some cases it's not. Maybe it all comes together immediately. But in my experience and in a way to write and teach about it, it's a sequential process. And that's one of the reasons we talk about mindfulness first, or awareness first, because mindfulness-based stress reduction strategies are extremely effective to help people ground themselves and help them get, when they're starting to become reactive, when their fight or flight starts to go, they recognize it, and then they can shift their attention to the present moment, a neutral or a pleasant objective attention to help ground themselves. So that's the first place that these awareness-based self-regulation strategies come in place, because we know that when you are in your fight or flight, or when you're in a survival mode, your mental bandwidth narrows, right? And your energy moves more into your body so that you can fend off whatever the threat is. So if we're not actually in a situation where we are threatened, if we are able to get out of that mode and into a place that our bandwidth expands because we're more grounded, that's the first step. Then we can start to actually see the different, what the differences are. And that's where that's what this book is hoping to address with the universal themes or golden threads. If we start with what we have in common, the many, many commonalities that we have, then, and I'm not kidding myself or anybody else saying that there aren't significant differences, but if we start by focusing on what we have in common, then we're able to start to see the commonalities, maybe have a little more empathy, and from there go in and try to bridge differences, as opposed to being so absolutely certain that we know the answer. And again, I find this meditation, the biggest relief I've had through meditation practice is becoming really comfortable with the fact of how little I know.
We could spend an entire episode just on that last statement there, and maybe we can come back to it. But you referenced something that I felt like you were taking us to, and that, I wanted to nudge us to eventually, which is golden threads. And I would love for the audience to just kind of explain what exactly you mean by that, and maybe name some of them, because it may help kind of create some, I like the web analogy, right, that you're weaving here. And I think these would be some additional important threads to kind of this web of understanding.
Well, golden threads is a nod to an educational psychologist named Jerome Bruner, who used this term about you choose a few concepts and you weave them through the entire curriculum. And he was well known for saying something along the lines, and I'm sure I will mess up this quote, that you can teach a child anything at any stage of development, so long as you contextualize it within their level of understanding, but that you can teach them, any child, pretty much anything at any stage of development. So the golden threads, it's a nod to him because I always just loved that idea. And it also resonated with my experience all the time that I've had working with kids. And the idea of golden threads are universal themes that you see in many wisdom traditions that are the same: kindness, compassion, love, change, everything changes, interdependence, renunciation. Those are just a few of them. Safety, the need to be safe, Yearning is also talked about in many of the traditions. So these are areas of commonality among the different traditions, the different cultures, that are places that we can really start to sink into, and we can start to really explore those themes and see how they can work in our everyday life. How will they help us navigate this world with a little more wisdom and compassion? So those are examples of the golden threads. The ones that I've always taught with my kids, because I've worked with kids for years, and then also in family systems, because then I taught teachers and parents, were attention, balance, compassion, and playfulness. And I think playfulness is one that is really often left aside, and it's a mistake, because it works, the lightheartedness, not taking ourselves quite so seriously, being able to put a little less effort into things, not give up, but put in just the amount of effort that's required. That's been a very useful reminder for me in my life and in the life of many people that I work with.
So one of the key questions you address in your book is, how can I lead a meaningful life? Mm-hmm. And you address this through golden threads, right? Mm-hmm. So how has your work on the golden threads helped you address that huge question? That also brings us full circle to what Nick said earlier about meaning being maybe another way of expressing enlightenment. Well,
obviously, no, meaning is not going to be the same for every single person, right? Everybody is going to find something else that really gives their life meaning. So I don't, what gives my life meaning, I don't know how helpful that is. But what I would say is that we find meaning in life by, again, being able to connect with some of these ideas that resonate with us, that help us see the world a little bit differently, that help us break out of a fixed perspective that we have. And that's one of the ways in to start to find the meaning and see something a little bit deeper. Perhaps you already know what the meaning is for your life, and that's fantastic. I mean, I think many to most people do have a sense of meaning, but then being able to delve into it even more granularly to see that meaning isn't fixed like that either. Let's loosen it up and look at the different parts and pieces of the meaning that we identify with our meaning, and let's see how they are interdependent, not just what we identify with, but other things, and let's see how they change, and starting to see this more as a state of flux as opposed to something solid. That's where we can start to loosen up a little bit, I think, and often see things on a deeper level.
So you describe also in the book how meaningful transformation occurs in small actions that we take every day.
Yeah.
What's some examples? And this is going to get us onto, we want to get to the kind of 50 strategies you have in the book as well. Not all 50 of them, but some of them. I
just have to tell you, I did not choose to put 50 strategy. That's like publishers. How many do you, it's like, I did cards before for kids. You have to have at least 55. Anything less than 50, people don't think they're getting their money's worth. So the number.
You're not the first author to share stories like that with us.
Yeah. So the number is not meaningful to me.
All right, cool. Nice connection with meaning there as well. Okay, so what's some examples of daily actions we can all do then to promote meaningful transformation?
Well, let's go back a second to the first question you were asking, which is small moments every day.
Yeah.
We can have lots and lots of big ideas, and it's important. And what these golden threads do is they give you a much vaster worldview. There's a great quote by a Tibetan sage, Padmasambhava, that is, may your view be vast as the sky, but your conduct needs to be as fine as barley flour. So I don't know if you guys know meditators. I don't know if you're in that world at all, but I certainly have met a lot of meditators, fabulous people doing great work. And I've also met a bunch of meditators who are fabulous people, but they've spent an awful lot of time on the cushion, but you don't really see it show up in their daily life. So for me, and I think I said this before, the purpose of meditation is the awareness, of course, but then how can I take it off the cushion and get it into my life? And how that happens is with small actions, the things we do and say. And that those small actions have a ripple effect beyond us. If we're just a little bit less neurotic, if we're just a little bit kinder, if we're a little more patient, it affects the people around us. So that's the idea of these small actions. And I'll also say that when it comes to looking at people who have done significant inner work of any kind, I'm often asked, how can you tell if there's progress? Of course, progress is a loaded word in this context, but how can you tell if it's working? Working is a loaded word in this context. But what I'd say is how I get a sense of the effort that is going into this inner work is when you start to see it spill out into the small things people do and say every day.
Nice.
Makes sense. Yeah, makes
absolutely.
good sense. We'll start to slowly kind of wrap up here, but it's also a good segue into kind of our, if you want, signature question. So we always ask this, aptly titled flourishing question. And I think you've kind of tapped into a couple things already, but taking something that's non-conceptual or maybe feels a little abstract, but making it sort of practical, whether that's mindfulness, basic practices, maybe that's meditation, maybe it's, thinking more about these golden threads. Like, you've covered a lot of really useful things here, but where do you typically advise? Let's say most of our audience is adult. So granted, lots of work with children, but you're speaking to an adult population. Where do you advise maybe they get started? Or if they want to help their children start to do some of this, where would they get started with their kids? Maybe both of those.
Yeah, it would be different for kids. The big takeaway here is that if folks want to take on the big project and not start small, we can always start small, but since, you guys it's flourishing, so let's just go for it. What I would encourage people to do is bring awareness to whether what they're doing is they're focusing on the goodness of what they're doing and letting go of expectation. Now, that doesn't mean that we actually let go of expectation. It means, again, that we're aware of, I was really hoping that if I did this podcast, these things would happen. And then all of a sudden, my ego is involved in this. And I have a hope and I have an expectation. And that's not where freedom lies. Freedom lies when we focus on the goodness of what we're doing, do the best job we can, and do our best to let go of our hopes and dreams and expectations for results. And sure enough, we will have them because we're human, but to view those lightly and with a sense of humor. So that's what I would say for adults. Try to focus on the goodness of what you're doing. Kids, we really need to help kids with two things. One is basic self-regulation practices. Basic practices that many, many schools are doing now, where they're anchor practices, where what you do is when you're finding yourself upset or overwhelmed, what you do is you move your attention away from thinking about what you're upset about, because that just tends to make people more upset, into a present moment experience. Feeling your feet on the ground, feeling the movement of breathing, remembering a lot of kids have trouble sitting still. So some kind of walking, shaking practice, like shaking like this, is a great way, if you've got a lot of nervous energy and you're upset, to release that energy and ground. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and this is for adults and children and everyone, if you're going to choose one practice, if you have some self-regulation strategies already in place, it would be appreciation. And appreciate the small things, the little things that are here right now. And sometimes when times are really, really tough, it's hard to find anything. So then you kind of appreciate, the feet that your body is working so you can get yourself to the kitchen sink. Or you can, even if things are really bad, you can just appreciate that you've got a kitchen sink. Sometimes we have to get that tiny in order to find something that we appreciate. And sometimes, there's a lot around to appreciate, so we just soak it in. But appreciation is a game changer.
Love it. Interesting you brought up anchoring. I was just chatting with a group of athletes about this yesterday. It always makes me think of, you've seen Inception, the movie Inception. They use totems, right, to kind of tell when they're in a particular reality. I think that's just a good visual, but I appreciate that notion of doing it physically as well as a way of establishing that anchor. Really, really good stuff.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. This has been fun.
It's been a great time. Yeah, really appreciate it. Learned a lot. Yeah. Will you tell us a little bit about where we can find you, where our audience can engage with you more, learn more about you, some of your material, those sorts of things?
Yep, the easiest way to find me is by my name. So my website is susankaisergreenland.com. I'm most active on Instagram and Facebook under either Susan K. Greenland or Susan Kaiser Greenland. And, if you're interested, you can sign up for a newsletter, which is basically mostly practice-based to try to give people, clear, concise understanding of perhaps what a theme is, and then a simple takeaway and how to apply it.
Awesome.
Great.
Thank you so much, Susan. So Susan's book, Real World Enlightenment, Discovering the Ordinary Magic in Everyday Life, came out this month, July 2024. It's a fantastic book, contains 50 powerful tools for modern wisdom seekers, full of practical strategies to foster meaningful connections and alleviate the pressures of modern life. We've loved talking about it with you today. Susan, thank you so much for enlightening us. Excuse the pun. Really enjoyed this. Loved your book. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Susan. Thanks so much for listening to Flourish FM. We hope you enjoyed the content. Please be sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to your podcast and on all major social media platforms.
And if you visit our website, flourishfmpodcast.com, you can sign up to our newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter. First newsletter of every month, we share a long form blog. And every newsletter, every week, we share highlights from our previous episodes. Please hit subscribe on our website.